He was a man that is seen in many ways. He was a Texas Ranger. He did battle the Indians. He was a trail driver. He did become a large rancher. And there's the story of him filing on the water holes and that way amassing even more land. Some had animosity toward him because they called it the land grab. He was hurt and offended that he was looked at in that manner because one time he said that he'd probably spent more money on educating kids than any man alive, and he had none of his own. He certainly wasn't stealing from the school children of Texas, but he was all of those things and a demanding person. You had to do it right. And but also, I think he was a very gentle, caring person. He was interested in the land, interested in animals being well cared for. He did much for the community. He was very civic-minded. He was a member of the First Methodist Church in the Texas Panhandle here at Claude. There were 6 people, Mr. and Mrs. Goodnight, another couple, and a couple of cowboys, and presumably, and I don't know this, they said one was a black cowboy and one was a white, and he had a black cowboy that was a close friend of his banker, his scout, everything. He carried the money when they were coming back from trail drives. He was close to him, and he may have been that. I like to think that that man that was such a good friend of his was the other one. But that was the 3rd Methodist church he had helped found. In other parts of Texas, his mother was a very religious lady, and he had, helped get those started. So he was a man of many, many facets, I think. My dad was raised there. He came as an infant. His mother was housekeeper there for Mr. and Mrs. Goodnight. She had been a close friend of Mary Ann Goodnight's previously. And his home became their home. He raised my dad as his son in many ways. When he was a little boy, my mother said that Mrs. Goodnight had told her how that Goodnight was a lot to say, Mr. Goodnight and Mrs. Goodnight, which would have been the only thing he would have called them. He certainly wouldn't have said Charlie. And so he shortened it to Night. And he would, in the evening, when it was everybody else gone and just them, his mother and Mr. and Mrs. Goodnight, and it was time for him to go to bed, well, he'd go in and tell them good night. And it was Night and Ms. Night that he told good night to. And they raised him. I've heard that it took Mrs. Goodnight and my dad's mother both to correct him because Goodnight just couldn't stand for them to paddle him. He said Mrs. Goodnight would take the colonel off somewhere, and his mother would administer the paddle because Goodnight just couldn't stand it. She expected him to go barefoot in the summer. His mother expected him to go barefoot in the summertime to save money. And Goodnight took him to town so many times to buy him shoes. When he found him barefoot, she quit trying because he didn't want him to be without shoes. When he went on trips, he always brought him back something. Little spoons, it said, where he had been. A little book with Cleo and 1901, I believe is the date on it. Just little things that he would bring back. He kept him well stocked with books. Goodnight wasn't formally educated, but was well educated. He had educated himself, except to write. His writing was terrible, and there are many stories about how bad his writing was, even to the fact that he couldn't sometimes read his writing. It said probably wasn't important anyway, and toss it out. Anyway, he taught my dad many things, and Dad was very well versed in the care of the buffalo and the running of the ranch. He was a horseman. When he met Mother, they married. She was 18, he was 21. He wanted Goodnight first told Mother he'd send her to college first if she'd go. He was very much interested in education, but she and Daddy were planning to get married, and that was the end of that. He had told Daddy that he had sent him to college about years before when he finished, and Dad felt an obligation to go to work rather than take him up on it. He was, my dad was 19, so I have heard, and running a threshing crew when Goodnight drove out to the field and said he'd let his foreman go, and so take over the threshing crew, and Clell, come to the house with me. We've got to sit down, and you're taking over. He was 19 when he was made foreman of the Goodnight Buffalo Ranch, which we think of today as rather young, but when you think that Goodnight was working a man's job and on his own at about 15, I'm sure he thought nothing about telling my dad to take over at 19. The letters that he has written that my dad had, he always signed K-N-I-G-H-T. The time evolved from when my dad as a baby had called him Knight. He reached back as an older man and took the Knight from his roots, and to Dad he was always Knight, K-N-I-G-H-T. I've never seen it anywhere else where he used that, but he used it in letters to my dad from the time he was little. There's one letter when my dad's probably 8 or 10, something like that, and Goodnight is gone, and he writes to Dad and is telling him what to do to take care of this. Be sure you do such and such, all about his chores on the ranch. And the dog, one of the dogs there, has had pups, and Goodnight admonishes him particularly to take care of that dog. She needs care now, and he signs it Knight. After Mother and Dad married and my sister was born, Mary Joyce, he was gone, and presumably from the way the letter goes, they had written him something that my sister had said about his picture or something, and he says, oh, so Mary Joyce still remembers her old Knight, does she? And here again he uses the K-N-I-G-H-T. I think she was about 2 years old when this transaction occurs.